Um, I know a lot about Scarsdale history and Scarsdale, Black people who lived in Scarsdale. I know a lot, but a little bit less about Edgemont. And then as we go further out from there up to Fairview or further out in the county, I know a little bit, but not nearly as much. But it's good to talk about Edgemont because it's part of Greenburgh. If you don't know, I don't know where everybody's from, but you've got the town of Greenburgh, and within there you've got Edgemont. Edgemont is a school and a fire district that's within, but it's not its own independent town or village or anything like that, like Scarsdale is. So it has a slightly different relationship with the rest of Greenburgh that, say, Scarsdale does with Westchester. All right, so let me get going on. I'll share my screen and I'll get going on here and slideshow and present. All right. So just a couple things who I am. I was a public defender in the Bronx for about a decade. And this was a pretty high profile case. And then after that, I actually went back to school at night and got a master's degree, and I taught fifth grade in the Bronx, the Southeast Bronx, for another 7 years on top of that. So I've been, I am white, but I've been around issues of race for some time. And I've seen how it just, how it's in everything. So that's kind of where a lot of my interest in it came from. And a couple of years ago, I was asked to do a presentation on the history of volunteerism in Scarsdale. And as I was looking into it, with no offense to anyone, it was like all old white men. And I don't mean to say that in a negative way. I aspire to be an old white man myself someday, but it didn't feel like it was including everybody. And it felt like it was a story that had already been told in many places. And I wanted to tell the stories of people who were just as important, but those stories who weren't told. So I started looking into Black history in Scarsdale then. And another thing that interested me is that I kept coming across things from the 60s and somewhat in the 70s and a little bit in the 80s, where this topic of that the awareness of Black people's underrepresentation in Scarsdale and Edgemont was talked about. And there were articles about it and letters about it and actions about it. And I was kind of confused because I haven't lived here. I didn't live in this area back then. I grew up in Hastings, but I didn't know what happened. Like, where did the discussion go? Because at some point there were discussions about integration and busing and all sorts of things like that, and these actual efforts of that the community was working on, and now it seems like it's dissipated. So I wanted to know what happened. And then finally, right before I get started, I realized during my research it would be a little bit off for me to give a presentation without hearing Black voices. So I interviewed about a dozen people who had lived or worked in Scarsdale for about 1 to 2 hours each. And I did that right up until I had to make the initial presentation. I'm going to play for you a 10-minute video which just has some short clips later that I picked out as kind of representing what a lot of people spoke about. But the entire interviews, and some of them are great. They're all on YouTube in like unedited form. So, and some of them are really, really something. So I'm just letting you know about those other resources. I'll give you the link at the end. So we're going to back up to the beginning, talk about slavery in Edgemont. Well, as an initial matter, New York relied on slavery for 200 years, from when it was a Dutch colony starting in 1626, finally ending when the practice of slavery ended in 1827. Farmers and settlers depended on the labor of enslaved Africans. They were 1/5 of the colonial population in New York. In Edgemont, in the 1790 census, there was a, I'm just gonna run through and just mute a couple people who joined last minute, so that way I just hearing a little noise. I'll just take care of that, and then we don't have to worry about that. All right, great. So there were about 60 There, in Edgemont in the 1790 census, there was a white population of about 60 people and a dozen enslaved Black people. It's said that during the era of slavery, that certainly in the 1700s, there were more enslaved people in New York than there were in Georgia. And the only reason that New York didn't develop massive plantations full of enslaved people was not one of morality or ethics. It was because of the climate, and that it wasn't as economically advantageous to do so. So just that kind of puts a little bit of a framework on it. This is going to be no news to most of you participants, but when I was in school, we always tended to point towards the South. Down there, they did this, they did, and it obviously was not the case. And in fact, the remnants of slavery can be seen today in Edgemont on Old Army Road. This home was built in 1740. It's been since expanded, and behind it, where my cursor is over to the right from this picture from 120 years ago or so, stands one of Westchester's last remaining slave quarters. This is how it looks today. It's still there. Now, it's been in use for the past 150 years, not as that purpose, as a tool shed and so on, but the actual structure is still there. The Hunt family, who built the house, enslaved people. Soon after the Revolutionary War, the house was bought by Richard Morris, who was the second Chief Justice of the United States, the second Chief Justice of New York State, and also enslaved about a dozen people over time. If you go inside, it's about 9 by 12 feet. The fireplace here and a stone floor. There's reason to believe it may have originally been windowless, and the windows were added later, which gives you kind of an idea. And there was a second floor, which is no longer divided, but there would have been wood in between the first floor and the second floor, where up to 8 people slept above at any given time. So moving forward to the rural era, depending on the size of your screen, this may be difficult to see, but I'm just pointing out that this is the 1860 census. Edgemont was a farming community. That Black people at this point were not a substantial present, but they were present, including an individual named Andrew Steadwell, who's on the right about a third of the way down. And significantly, he owned land. He wasn't a tenant. He wasn't a farm worker living with a farmer. He owned his own property, valued at $500, which wasn't nothing back then. And I believe that was an Old Army Road. Over the rural era, the white population of Edgemont grew. The Black population largely stayed constant. But what I would like to introduce you to is, from looking through census records and digesting it, I found the family that was here the longest, or in Edgemont the longest, and grew very engaged in the community. So this is the Stewart family. The parents were Abraham and Sadie. The children were Charles and Lewis. You can see them on the left side of the screen. They came up to Westchester from the mid-Atlantic region, not an uncommon migration. Abraham may have been born into slavery in South Carolina in 1850, but he could read or write according to the census. They first showed up in Edgemont in the 1900 census, renting a former schoolhouse. The family went to the Greenville Reformed Church. It wasn't an all-Black church. It was, I think, due to them, an integrated church. It obviously then, as now, a very accepting place. Starting in 1906, Abraham advertised a family laundry, which you can see in the lower right. Platt Avenue is what's now known as Ardsley Road. And they even made little blurbs in the Inquirer, one when their daughter died, one when the mom and the boys paid a visit. And in the Christmas exercises, you can see that Charles and Lewis each played a part in them. They're getting older. Here we have their registration cards. By 1917, both sons have registered for World War I. Charles is a cook on the New York Central Railroad, and Lewis is a farmhand for a nearby dairy farm, the Detterer family. And it appears that the father, Abraham, has died because Lewis requests an exemption to support his mother and brother. I want to point you out to something that I didn't realize until I saw a different draft card. If you look at these cards, In the lower left-hand corner, it's black down here. What I learned was these cards were cut because this is a white man's card who I looked into, and that bottom left-hand corner, if person is of African descent, tear off this corner. So this is for World War I. The armed forces were still segregated for decades after that, but the point of that is that at that point, because they were segregated, Black soldiers were often segregated out and often assigned to menial labor, places with less opportunity for progression and promotion and so on. The armed forces weren't desegregated until after World War II in 1948. So this was, I think, to me, to see these two brothers and how they were immediately, shunted to the side is, for me, was striking. So here's where they lived right near here. This wasn't their dairy farm. This was the dairy farm right next door. And Lewis Stewart, who's pictured here on the right, he's holding a boy, Charles Park, who was later the fire chief. He was very much part of the community. And in 1923, at age 27, he joins the Greenville Volunteer Fire Company. Greenville is basically a part of Edgemont. Now it's a census district. Now it's kind of two main parts of it. So he joins the Greenville Volunteer Fire Company, and they changed the bylaws to allow him in. The old rule said that anybody who volunteered had to be, quote, free, white, and 21. He was 21, but he wasn't white. They changed the bylaws to let him in. This picture on the horse is about 1925. Also at this time, Lewis was partners with a man named Dick Wilson, who was a white man, and the two of them ran a dairy farm currently on the site of the Greenville School on Ardsley Road. When you look through the census records, you can see now Lewis and Charles, they're living together. Lewis is the head of the household. He's a dairy farmer, not just a farmhand, and now he's actually bought land on Old Army Road. It's where, I'll show you this picture here. It's the top part here, 2.5 acres he buys. He's got a pond. And I spoke with a woman who may have encountered him at some point.
I found cow.
She was going to sell seeds or something like that. Let me just run through the participants and just see if I can mute that. All right, looks like everybody's good. All right. So, the woman who went back there described that this area was very, very rustic at the time. It was woods and swampy, very wild, with ducks and geese and fox and deer. And that pond was called Louie's Pond. There was a 1-story wooden house. She goes there to try to sell seeds. It was an older Black couple. There was no electricity. There was wood smoke coming out of the chimney, a kerosene lamp. This would have been around 1955. They had a little yard, a lilac bush, the remains from an old windmill. And she says that the woman was dressed in a very stiff-laced bib, and she had a very antiquated look, and he was dressed kind of country-ish. It probably was him. He died in 1977 in New Rochelle. So he apparently fit in very well. And I'm going to talk about something that happened next, which really, it confused me until I kind of realized how this fits together. So just kind of tuck away his experience for a moment. Suburbanizing Edgemont. I'm going to go slightly out of order and slightly out of geography. I'm going to talk about White Plains for a second because I'm speaking to the White Plains YWCA. I think this is important because this man is he's definitely one of the top 10 most important men in Westchester history. In fact, I think he was voted that by the Journal News. So I'm going to talk to you about Errold Collymore, Westchester's fighting dentist, okay? He bought a home on South Lexington Avenue in White Plains in the Highlands neighborhood, so about 2 miles from the YWCA, in 1930. And he used a white intermediary to do so. He couldn't buy it straight. He had for a few years, he had a dental practice in White Plains without a problem. Shortly after buying in, a 7-foot high wooden cross was burned on his front lawn. New York, Westchester County, New York. He went out in his pajamas to take a picture of the burning cross with a camera in one hand and a rifle under his arm. 400 people wound up protesting his purchase at a neighborhood meeting and offered him a large sum of money to sell the house back to them and move on. He refused. He and his wife endured all sorts of threats and attempts to get them out. So you can see here on the upper right hand, this is from the Bronxville paper at the time, that the 500, here's what this is about. And I think this gives a lot of relevance today, as you're going to see in a second. What they're protesting is they're protesting purportedly. I'm not saying that they don't have other reasons, but what they're saying out loud is basically it's going to hurt the market value. And it's this idea of property values. And when I hear property values, my ears perk up, because you might be talking about property values, or you might be talking about something else. In this case, what they were talking about was if Black people are allowed to purchase homes in our neighborhood, they're claiming the value of it will go down, and we have so much of our money tied up in our homes that this guy's got to go. That's what they're saying. They start putting pressure on anyone who has to deal with him. So the white people who employ Black people are telling them, don't go to him for your dentist. They go to the White Plains YMCA, where he was on the board of, they had kind of like a Black steering board. They went to them and they said, if you reappoint him to your board, we are going to not give you donations anymore. And the Y caved. The Y did not appoint him, and a doctor who also bought property in the same neighborhood, kicked them off the board, because otherwise they would have to forgo all of these donations. So that was the environment. It's kind of strange. I don't think that White Plains was appreciably different than Edgemont in terms of the composition or the tolerance or whatever. So just I'll show you one more thing, and then I'll talk about it. But the gears are kind of turning about, what's going on here. He went on in his life. Actually, I'll just say before I move on, because I'll talk about some of the great things he did. So he organized the first chapter of the White Plains Greenburgh NAACP. He was president of the White Plains Colored Young Men's Christian Association. The Y was segregated. He secured later the desegregation of White Plains police force, movie theaters, public swimming pools and schools, equal pay for Black garbage men, the hiring of the first Black nurses at what's now Westchester Medical Center. He did amazing, amazing things during the time he was here. And then in 1999, he was honored after his death as one of the most influential people of the 20th century in Westchester and Putnam counties. He was number 6, right after Nelson Rockefeller, number 5. So just think about his reaction, the reaction to him, not too many years after Lewis Stewart bought 2.5 acres in Edgemont. So now what you have, I'm going to draw your attention back to Edgemont. Edgemont is developing rapidly in the 20s and 30s. There's a part near Central Avenue over here called Edgemont Hills. The developers grid it up and you can build your own house. And something was different now. So now you have Joshua Cockburn come in. He and his wife, Pauline. Joshua was a wealthy ship captain. He actually was a captain for the Black Star Lines, which was Marcus Garvey's industry. And so it was a black crewed steamship. They lived in Harlem. In 1932, they bought land in Edgemont Hills and built this house that you see here. After the house was built, they were sued by a neighbor who, because the deed covenants, this was a new thing, the deed covenants for Edgemont Hills said that, quote, Negroes could only reside in the neighborhood as servants and could not otherwise own or use the property. So a quote in the paper from a neighbor said that no one bore the Cockburns any personal antipathy, but their presence and that of other Black people would harm real estate values. Going back to that again, the same thing with Harold Collymore. But there's a difference. here, as you're going to see it in a second. So the New York Times of March 23rd, 1937, reports that residents of the Edgemont Hills neighborhood packed the courtroom because they wanted that deed covenant honored. And in 1937, the Cockburns, I say Cockburns because that's how it's spelled, it's pronounced Coburns, they lost their case. So the judge said, you got to go. I'm just taking a look through. I'll look at the comments in one second. They lost their case. So banned from the house that the land they bought and the house that they themselves had built. So the wrinkle here, well, the only silver lining to this is that the lawyers were smart, and they told the neighbor before they went and filed the judgment, and to enforce it, they said, if you file this, we're going to beat it on appeal, and then other Black people are going to be coming into the neighborhood, essentially using their racism against them. So the Coburns were allowed to stay in their home, even though there was a legal finding. It wasn't until 1948 that those sorts of discriminatory deed covenants were found illegal by the Supreme Court, or unconstitutional by the Supreme Court. Just looking through, seeing if there's anything to respond from. Yeah, good. I'm so glad. Okay, nothing that needs to be responded, but there's good stuff in the chat. I don't need to. Property values versus personal values. I know it's disguised. Okay, so this is the home today. So what happened? Because what you have, so now you've got, I would like to think, I know that the arc of justice eventually is supposed to bend in the right direction. But here we have Lewis Stewart. They're changing bylaws and they're welcoming him in. Then Harold Collymore comes to a neighboring community and they're protesting and burning crosses, and they can't get him out. And now they can get the Coburns out because now they have a legally enforceable way of kicking out any non-whites from the community. And it's, for somebody who likes to think that things get better, this is an instance where things are not getting better. So what does that have to do with? And I'm actually going to just do a close-up real quick. Oops, what's up? This, by the way, the house, if you don't see, if you ever go down Fort Hill Road, this is Joshua Coburn's anchor. He put this to his, on the boulder in front of his home. And I think it's a wonderful poetic statement, because it's like, it's not just showing where he came from. He's putting down an anchor, which is being like, I'm here and I'm not moving. So you've got a white man, black man partnering with a white man, having a business, joining the fire company, buying land. Things are going backwards. What does this have to do with? We might get into it a little bit later, but this has to do with the nature of suburbia. Suburbia was a new thing. That in the 1800s, in the first part of the 1900s, if you're in a farming community, which is what Edgemont was, if you are growing stuff over here and somebody else has something else over here, it's really not your business unless they're diverting water from you. It doesn't matter. Your property value is based on what you extract out of the land, whether that's milk, whether that's corn, whatever it is. That's what the value of the land is based on. With the suburban era, you started having something new, where all of a sudden now the value of your property is based on what other people do and who they supposedly are. So now the basically white Anglo-Saxon Protestants want to keep their neighborhoods filled with people like them. It's distressing. And then as developers figure this out, you get the transition from Collymore to Coburn, where now they couldn't get Harold Collymore out. He refused to go. With Coburn, now you start having deed restrictions that are saying that legally enforceable, that you can't sell to anybody else. So things were tightening up because of people's desire to be able to control other people in suburbia. And before we point to the past, and I mean, I know most of you are, I'm sure, aware of this, but a lot of people are like, oh, those terrible people back in the 30s. There's still things like that today. So there's been studies right now about that. A lot of white people still don't want to be in the neighborhood with people who aren't like them. So it's just a way of, I guess, bringing things forward to the present, that it's not, this obviously is not a done thing. You can't have legally enforceable restrictions and things like that. You can't be steering people as they used to steer people deliberately. Black home shoppers would be steered up to Fairview in Greenburgh, down to Yonkers, various places. Now you can't legally do that anymore, but the situation is not dead. So I'll give you a chart as we're moving forward a little bit in time. This is what's happening in Scarsdale. Edgemont is going to be pretty similar. Other neighborhoods may be also similar. That the Black population is actually going up as you go through the 20s and the 30s into the 40s. But the Black household percentage, the ones who own their own homes, have their own homes, is going down. Most of the increase in this blue line is actually Black women who are living, either they don't have kids or they're living apart from their children, and they come and they're basically live in help during this era. So this is what you're seeing. I have in my Scarsdale presentation a lot more about other homeowners, because there was a significant Black population near White Plains at that point. As you're moving forward in time, people still, I'm not going to drain these, but even the lower right, 1953, the ads in the Scarsdale Inquirer, you would still see the race of the domestic workers still could be listed in there. It was just out in the open. All right, so I'm going to move forward to the post World War II era. So this is moving forward a bit past World War II. This is the late 60s. We started to have this very different public conversations about race. As you may know, as a independent school district and fire district in Greenburgh, that area of Edgemont has periodically sought to secede, or rather incorporate itself as its own village within Westchester County. In the 60s, this was assailed. You can see here, this Black leader objects, quote, "The only reason," I'm not saying this is true, but this was the conversation around the time. It may be true. "The only reason they want to incorporate is to avoid having low-cost housing for Negroes," they say, declared Weldon C. Cheatham. He's a leader of Greenburgh and the executive director of the town's youth service organization. And there's some evidence that since then, certain things, well, there have not been lower cost housing placed down in Greenburgh, or recreational facilities that would be used by everyone in Greenburgh, but those things were steered away from there. It's said to keep Edgemont from incorporating themselves. However, there was an awareness that Black people were underrepresented in Edgemont, and an understanding of how their absence negatively impacts everyone. And they talked about not only it affects the Black students and their parents who aren't able to be here, but also, of course, the white students who wouldn't be prepared to live in a multicultural society without those day-to-day interactions that they would be having in school. So here on the left, you see that there's the kind of Edgemont Community Council's group urging the Board of Ed to do more in terms of integration. They brought in what's called the STEP program, Student Transfer Education Program, because there were still segregated schools in the South. So they started that up to allow some of the best kids from those schools to come up and most, education, the valedictorian, salutatorian, to finish up their education in Edgemont and help as they're, going off to college. That was started in 1970. Then this is kind of the big view to put it all together. This is Scarsdale, but Edgemont is going to look very similar. That at some point in the 1800s, the Black resident percentage was quite high. Not, it was probably as high or higher than Black people's representation in the country as a whole. But it slowly, the resident population slowly went down. There was a little bit of a boom from live-in domestic workers, but it went down to the low single digits. On the red line, that's the Black household percentage. It had a little spike in the 1800s, down, down, down. So also low single digits. It's come back a little bit since then, but we're still in low single digits. And just to give you an idea, depending on how big your screen is, so this is a large slide. I'm not going to give you everything on it, but this is talking about Westchester County, Black population by race, the percentage of each area or each census district. So the highest is Mount Vernon, 65%. The next one is Fairview, 57%. Fairview is a part of Greenburgh. It was in the 1800s, it was a fairground. And because it was the cheapest, swampiest land, Black people were allowed to buy there and built up a substantial community there. And later, there's parts called Parkway Gardens, where Cab Calloway lived and Moms Mabley lived, Roy Campanella, Gordon Parks, a bunch of, big shots and people, celebrities or whatever, but also middle class and up people. So that still now is a heavily Black area. And then as you go down, it's going to be on the right side. Greenville is what you would call Edgemont in the census district, and that's about 3%. Scarsdale, it says 1%. I think it's a little bit more than that, but not appreciably more. And then some, bizarrely, I almost can't believe that it's actually true that Chappaqua has no Black people living in it. Rye has 0.3%. But so that's kind of the legacy of discrimination and segregation, people being steered off. You can live here, but you can't live here. That's remains to what we have today. I'm gonna actually, before I give you this, I'm gonna play for you. I think though, I'm gonna give you about a 10-minute video of, I think, what's the most affecting part of my presentation. And depending on your background, much of this may resonate with you personally. But these are the Black voices. These are a number of people who came from Scarsdale, and I stressed out to edit them down because they talked about all sorts of things. All those videos are online, and I don't mean to say everything's this way or everything's that way. I just picked out some salient quotes that I think are resonant. So you're going to hear first from Jaretta Crabb. Actually, she lives in White Plains now. She's going to talk about her parents buying the home that she grew up in Scarsdale. You're going to hear how this is relevant in a second, but just for background, both of her parents are Black. Her mother was very light-skinned. Her dad had a darker complexion, okay? So let me pull this up and share. And let's see, share that, share sound, optimize. Okay, I'll make this big, oops. All right, off we go.
My father and mother looked at houses. Some of the houses my father didn't look at if the family was going to be home. This is 1969. And then so my parents looked at the house and the owners were not home. They went to contract. At contract, my father came. And that was the first time that the owners had seen my parents. And so they actually signed the contract. And then that evening, they got home and my father received a phone call from the owner of the home saying, my wife is threatening to kill herself. She is going to pull up all the plants outside the house if you buy this house. We had no idea that you were Black and she can't do it. I'm going to give you $10,000. Think of that. The house is $40,000 in 1969, which is a lot of money now. Yeah. And I'm going to give you $10,000 to get out of this deal. Then my father said to him, I'm very sorry your wife is going to kill herself, but that is our house.
Junior high school, you start being aware of, race as being something more than, it's not just, okay, different colors in the crayon box kind of thing. There's more social and political, aspects to that. What struck me the most was here we are, entering puberty, and all of a sudden this, girls are talking about boys and who's cute and who likes whom and blah, 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 blah. I was excluded from those conversations. Or when I say excluded, I mean, I could be sitting at the same lunch table while, the girls are talking, but I'm not really I'm sort of like being ignored in the conversation.
Yeah.
That wasn't something, Yeah. And so that was interesting to me. I mean, this was, it was never, said that, Shelley, you can't like
Right.
white boys, or white boys aren't supposed to like you, but it's just one of those things that you intuit. I didn't go to my prom because there was no one to invite me to my prom.
When I went to high school in the 70s, and I felt like I had to work twice as hard to be known as half as good. And I think people did see me as the great student and an excellent student and an A student and all of that. But, I still don't feel like I was always seen as equal. And then there are lots of things that were said, as I could write a book, but it was clear that I wasn't. And, that was like the height of also the age of affirmative action. And I watched a friend of mine who, he's a brilliant physician to this day and excellent student. And, when he got into a top school and when I did, and my brother who was basketball team, tennis team captain, A student, there was a huge amount of resentment, but resentment to the point of racism. Mm-hmm. And somebody wrote an article in the school paper my year that was really, really demeaning of minority students. And when I wrote back, there's a very condescending reply, and nobody spoke up and said anything. It was just me. I was, the solo voice. So it still is that feeling of you work twice as hard to prove you're half as good. But that doesn't stop us. It doesn't stop my family and many others, and that's the way it works. But yeah, there was a lot of that, as is there are a lot of wonderful people, wonderful supportive people that I encountered. I could, fill just as large a book on that.
The toughest part about growing up there for being a Black guy growing up there was not coming from a lot of money, having friends that had someone that had so much, including my closest friends. Because you can't say, hey, yeah, can you take me that? No, that's just wouldn't be appropriate, nor would I have thought to do so. Because you're a Black kid, you're not supposed to ask people for help because then they think you're stupid or think you can't do it. I think that message came more from just how society was, and a little bit of like my parents, like people say, oh, if they're Black, they're getting a handout or something, even though we weren't, obviously, but
right, yeah,
but and you think that these other kids are moving it on their own, not realizing, okay, well, well, Dad owns Hartford Insurance, and he's got a friend who's at E.F. Hutton, and so his son's going to get that internship at E.F. Hutton. There were those they're very good teachers, but they weren't. I don't think they were consciously unfair. But I knew that my work had to be perfect or close to perfect.
My parents were very deliberate and intentional about us seeing a more diverse community. So 2 things that they did intentionally was, one, we would go to New York City to Black churches, and then summers, my parents enrolled us in the Harlem School of the Arts. The other thing they did was join this organization called Jack and Jill. And, you had to be invited. It has a reputation of being bougie. And, but yeah, they were all spectrum of Black families in the organization. We would have monthly meetings and events. And so you got to meet other African-American kids. And so you had this peer group that were going to, White Plains High and Chappaqua and New Rochelle. Some of my sister's best friends, were in that group, and some of mine as well that became, lifelong friends.
Sometimes I would be on my paper route And the people would open the door and say, oh, would you like a cookie or whatever? And then we start talking, and then they would say, you know, I just love your hair. Can I touch it?
Oh my God.
And so then I would like bow my head down and let them touch my hair. Let them like pat it. And it happened more than once. It happened multiple times. And at that point, you know, I knew I was the ambassador for my race.
Right.
But yeah, that kind of like solidified, like, okay, I guess I'm gonna have to have my afro touched because of their curiosity, because they don't know anybody. And so maybe they're gonna think it's steel wool, and they would always say after they touched my hair, it's so soft, like, you know, surprised, like as if it could be steel wool or something. And another thing that would really bother me is after vacation time, you know, a lot of the kids would go on these really nice vacations, especially in the winter, go to these islands, and they'd get tan, and they'd come back, and then they'd want to run up to me and put their arm next to my arm to see how dark they were, if they were darker than me. I mean, and that happened all the time.
Go to class one day, and there's a black girl sitting in class. She's sitting right up front. And Jordan, I don't know, it all of a sudden came to me that, that all of the black students, the brown students that I had at Scarsdale High School would come into class and always sit up front. In other words, once again, I get the look of the, you know, they weren't hiding. They wanted me, if the one damn thing they're going to do, they're going to say, connect with me. I attribute that to their parents a great deal, because parents can sometimes tell you or can suggest that you don't want to be invisible here. You don't want to go Ralph Ellison here. You don't want to give that shit any more, invisible man shit, any more fuel. In other words, this cat, go get it.
Yeah.
He's not there by mistake. Go get it.
I had an afro until 8th grade when Mrs. Graves came to my house and she said to my mother, we're going to straighten her hair. Doretta cannot have an afro anymore. And my mother had really like white hair. So Mrs. Graves straightened my hair in the kitchen sink. I remember sitting there so clearly, and she put this cream in my hair and she kept working it and pulling it straight and pulling it straight. And my afro was beautiful.
Oh.
I had one of the best afros around. It was literally, I can still pat it. It was this big. So and I used to have like longer hair, and my mother wanted me in 2nd grade, I think, to have a haircut like my friend Pam Glideman. So my mother cut my hair short, and I think Pam had like the Dorothy Hamill, whatever, haircut. And then we washed my hair, and it came out as an afro.
Your mom had no idea.
From like 2nd grade on, I had this afro. So so she washed it in the sink, and then she straightened it, and then she washed it after. And I remember she blew it dry. I remember looking in the mirror and just being in shock. I couldn't believe it. I was so happy.
Oh.
Wow, now I can start to feel like all my friends. I used to just dream of having hair like my friends. Think of that. You're black and you have this afro, and all your friends have this flowing long hair, and I just used to fantasize about it.
All right. So I think that's it for me. I'm going to pass it over to, I think either Maria or Tasha are going to take over for a bit. And I'm going to put in the chat, I will put a link to a playlist with all of those videos. That's the thing that actually stressed me out the most about this was how do you pick a minute and a half out of somebody describes their experience for an hour and a half? So I don't mean to say that things are all like this or all like that. So look at those videos. The video with Rashid is great and insightful and funny. The video with Jaretta has also a lot of views. People like that one a lot too. But I'll put that link in the chat, and then we'll come back for questions in a bit. So I guess back to either Maria or Tasha. I don't know who's picking it up from here.
I'm right here, Jordan.
Okay.
Thanks so much. I'm gonna find a way to make sure folks can see me. And if not, we'll just keep on keeping on. And I'm gonna ask Tasha, as we keep referencing her, make sure that she's off camera as well. Fantastic. And so I'm gonna actually add that spotlight. Great. So I am really pleased that Tasha's here with us, and thank you so much, Jordan. I mean, this is not my first time having seen that presentation from you, and every time it feels like I'm just going back and traveling with you on this journey. I am just continued to be inspired by what history can teach us when we just look at what's right there before our eyes with some context and information. So thank you so much for the work you do in Scarsdale and really for the whole county. Now, history is fantastic. I'm a big fan of it. And it also can provide some lessons, some insight into what's happening currently. And to help us connect the dots between what we just heard and what we know that we're experiencing right now is Tasha Young. Tasha is my friend. I'll say that first. It's not in her bio, but it's important to me. And she is an adjunct lecturer of policy at NYU's Silver School of Social Work. She's a community activist. She's a policymaker and a mom, and a big mama to her granddaughter, Monroe. She currently serves as a member of Greenberg Against Systemic Racism's Housing Committee, the Greenberg Human Rights Committee, the Black Women's Political Caucus, White Plains Greenberg Chapter, NAACP, White Plains Greenberg, Westchester Women's Agenda Policy Committee member, Women in Leadership Committee member, and co-founder, of the Fairview Empowerment Group, and she's also a member of the Westchester Anti-Racist Alliance. Tasha is also a decades-long resident of Greenberg, and she has dedicated her professional and personal life toward connecting people through the practice of humanizing one another. Her approach to anti-oppressive practices is bringing multiracial groups together through similarities and common interests as a means to get to the crux of any matter. White dominance hurts us all. Tasha, I would love for you to share with us the current realities and experiences that you yourself know and are organizing in Greenberg and other areas with your community members about, and offer any reflection on the presentation that Mr. Copeland has just offered to us. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. I love you. And I just want to give you your flowers. Every time I speak to you, you're doing such great work with this center. You humanize the daily challenges of, just dealing with racism, no matter what race you are. You humanize how difficult and that we need to keep staying together to get this work done, to eradicating it. So thank you for all you do. I want to, if I can, start with the reflections first because it's fresh on my mind. And so much of what the speakers said resonate with what is happening every day, all day for Black people. So I want to just start with the teacher from Scarsdale with the representation matters confirmation, how students, came in front of the class because they had a Black teacher, and they wanted to get what he had to offer. That's true today. I also want to talk about the hair. As a Black woman, hearing those women talk about the hair and people wanting to touch it and how it bothered her, but that laugh was a means of survival. That's so familiar. And she said she felt like she had to be the ambassador for the race, and just, really talking about how heavy that daily burden is, particularly now that it's Black History Month, and just really normalizing our humanity. And then the twice as good, to be working twice as hard to be half as good, not asking for help. That just really speaks to some of what I want to talk about in relationship to the presentation, the practices and behaviors of racism. What we are challenged with, what we have to do just to show up every day that, frankly, people that are white don't have to involve themselves with. How we wear our hair, the burden of representing the entire race to be accepted. These are concepts that are not laws, but it's the effect of living and being marginalized by society. So what are we dealing with today in terms of housing is much of what we've been dealing with throughout our whole presence in Greenburgh. And I really appreciate, and I want to thank you so much, Jordan, for the scholarship of your report, for bringing us into the enslaved presence in Edgemont. Because for myself, I knew about the enslaved presence in the villages on the river because of Phillipsburg Manor, which is a plantation, and the Dutch settlement of New York. They were involved in the transatlantic slave trade period. So I did not know about an enslaved African presence in Edgemont. Thank you for that. And then, talking about Fairview, another thing I liked about your presentation is the percentage of Black people that live in Fairview alone. It's not even the town of Greenburgh. It's just this one little neighborhood. 17% Black population of Greenburgh is in Fairview. So I thought that was pretty interesting, right under Mount Vernon. And, I grew up in Northern Elmsford, which is Greenburgh. And, I always knew there was something very special about that Fairview area. So you really helped to identify that. And another special thing about Fairview is because of the cluster of Black residents, homeowners and renters, it always was also a catalyst for a lot of innovation. And what I know about when you have been put on the margin or have faced oppression, it does breed a climate for ingenuity and creativity and innovation. And we have that coming from Fairview. But it begs the question, the Black people in Fairview, are they there because they wanted to or because they were segregated to live there? So we are still examining that question, quite frankly. We are still challenged with property values being undervalued through assessment. This is the work that we're doing right now at the Greenburgh Against Systemic Racism, which was started by Councilwoman Gina Jackson, also giving her flowers. And we're looking at the historical disparity in housing in Greenburgh. So bringing it in from Jordan's presentation into modern day, it's a combination. It is, yes, Black people were forcibly segregated into certain parts of the town through things like restrictive deed covenants, through terror and intimidation, through loaning practices from the banks. We have to remember systemic racism, and I'll use a definition in a minute, I'm not looking at my notes yet, but it's across systems. And we see that then, and we see it now. The business presence in Edgemont by the two dairy farmers, there's no reference today to Black businesses in Edgemont, but there were Black businesses then, which was just outlined. The urban renewal, and I could read from my notes now. Urban renewal was a choice made by the government to participate in that program. But what the program did is remove blight and slums. And because we know of disparate income outcomes, there were Black homeowners and Black business owners displaced during urban renewal. So the vestiges of the past still play through the policies, practices, and laws of today. So we've made great progress, apparently. Obviously, we all know that there's been progress from Black people nationally in our state and locally. However, Black home ownership, again, to Jordan's presentation, is down and going down because of laws, practices, and behaviors. And I want to keep repeating that because it's not what we do in suburbia. It's not always the N-word. It's not always racial terror, but it could be a practice, a behavior of, we don't want you here and we're not going to stand for you being here. So I want to open it up for questions. So I'm not going to talk too much longer, but in the Fairview community, we are looking at displacement of people that live in what was public housing because of either renovation or they just are no longer going to qualify for the programs that had allowed them to live there before. It is incumbent upon all of us to look at particularly housing, and know that when we say no justice, no peace, it has to apply to policy in every area: banking policy, housing policy, education policy, as well as criminal justice. Because the quality of life and the sanctity of all of us, but particularly for people of color and Black people in this example, is contingent around disrupting policies, practices, and behavior that disenfranchises one group of people, but advantages another group of people. So with that, I really do want to hear from everyone else. I have my notes. I have a lot of other things I could say, but I would really like, if it's okay, to open up for discussion.
Sure. Thank you so much for that, Tasha. And of course, questions can be, I invite folks at this point, if you have a question, feel free to come off chat. Come off mute. You can also use the chat, that's okay. But this can really be a community conversation now. And maybe your question, Jordan has been so gracious with his time. He has let me know that he can stay on as long as folks have things to ask about his process, about ways in which he found things. And also Tasha's available for questions as well. This program is advertised to go until 8:30, but this conversation is really important. So if you have questions for our speakers, they will stay and we will record. There's no silly question. And while most programs you go to will ask you to limit your question to just that, an inquiry, there might be a comment bubbling up. There might be things resonating and you're noticing that you're stringing your thoughts together. And I personally welcome the thoughts in draft because that might catalyze something else for someone else. So we welcome all responses, questions, comments, affirmation. Mr. Copeland, you have done some work here. And I know you saw in the chat how appreciative folks were to have learned of this and want to know how to spread it throughout all of Westchester. So also, I welcome folks to bring affirmations and encouraging greetings as well. Feel free to come right off mute. I don't see anything in the chat at this time.
I have, hi, Maria.
Hi.
Hi, I have a question. Sorry, I'm not on camera. I have a question for Jordan. What's the ethnic demographics of Edgemont now? It seems that there's a large Asian population. Could he speak to that?
Yes, there is a large Asian population. I think it's last I saw was about a quarter. And
so explain why Edgemont has become a haven for that ethnic group?
So yeah, I think it's so the Asian population in both Edgemont and Scarsdale was pretty much non-existent there were a few Chinese, people of Chinese descent and a few of Japanese descent, domestic workers. So I'll back up. It basically goes back to about a trickle in the 60s, in that when it's a longer story, but it's basically Hong Kong has always been a little bit more open. So there were people from Hong Kong who'd come to college in the US and settle here. And then in the 80s, you had a lot of Japanese people, which I think they were often expats. So they would come for 3 years or 5 years to do like a little business stint and then get sent home. But I think that sort of acclimatized the community to having an Asian presence. There would be Asian stores on Central Avenue. And then Taiwan opened up a little bit earlier. China really didn't open up until the 90s. So you really kind of couldn't get out of there. But you wound up having a lot of particularly Chinese professionals. There's also Southeast Asian and Indian and Pakistani, but I think the largest growth has been in people from China. And I think it's a really interesting thing to look at, because the population was once very, very low, but basically what the people, I've talked to a few people about it, what they were looking for was what everybody wants: good schools. They wanted a short commute to New York City. And it was like, once a few came, more come. And you wind up having Chinese American realtors who can speak to you in your own language with your own culture. And it kind of, then you might have, other sort of infrastructure that builds up around it. So it really builds on itself. So for the Chinese or Asian population to go from 15% to 25% in a decade is easier than a population to go from 2% to 10%. Or it seems easier in a way because it's got momentum. So the past decade has had a lot of momentum with that. Beyond that, I can't say that it's anything more than just commute, wealth to some extent, and why not another population? Why not Hastings? I couldn't say. It could essentially be random that the first 20 people wound up. Here's what I do know. There was a Chinese American school in Edgemont. So a lot of people who came here and wanted their kids to continue to speak Chinese wound up living near the school, and it kind of built up out of that. It was originally Taiwanese, and then it moved over to mainland China. Okay.
If I could comment, I know Colleen's hand is up, so I'll be brief. I do have another add to that question. So there's two things. There's a technology boom that we've experienced in the last 10 to 20 years. And in those industries, a lot of people were attracted to work in New York because of work. And in those companies, in those industries, there's heavy populations of Asian and South Asian Americans and people who become Americans. So that's one thing, but also we have to always just be honest about the history and legacy of anti-Blackness. So we are not sure if any of those communities experience the visceral rejection of them coming into the neighborhood. And it's funny because we had this discussion last night in class, and some of my Asian some of my Asian students were saying, this is the trope of the model minority. And they said it, this is not my words. And they said, it really hurts everybody when there is this idea that this group is more desirable than another group. It really is rooted in divide and conquer kind of thinking when it comes to people of color or the global majority. People that are within the global majority. So it really, again, upholds segregation and racism, and in some cases, it supports anti-Blackness.
And I know Colleen, but I just want to say one quick thing that I was talking about with Quantel actually earlier today, and that is my opinion about that the term people of color can often provide cover for communities that are diverse in some ways, but not diverse in terms of having a Black presence. And so, you know, I'm not sure where things are going to go in the future with that term, but it's tough to say. Well, I mean, Edgemont is very diverse. It's just not very Black. Scarsdale is very diverse, but it's not very Black at all. How can you say that a community with 1.5% Black population, when Black people are 1 out of every 8 people in the US, how can you make any conclusion about that is a diverse community, or that it's accepting of people? It's accepting of some people. So that's just my personal issue with the distraction or the diffuseness of the term people of color. There's a whole lot of people that go in under that, but we really want to focus on people who have borne the brunt of things.
Thank you for those responses. I'm glad at where we landed with that. Colleen. And
yeah,
then after Edith.
Yeah, I was just going to say that I think the population in Edgemont has shifted. When we were living there, up until 2013, I guess, I think there were a fairly significant number of Black families that lived there. Obviously, not as many as the Asians, but I think the same reason that we moved over to Hartsdale is the reason that others left. Once your kids are out of school, why pay these tremendous taxes in Edgemont in a community that doesn't make you feel part of it? And so if you're there primarily, you know, to get equity in your house, put your kids through school, once your kids are done, there's no need to stay in Edgemont. And I kept my roots partly in Edgemont and partly in the rest of Greenburgh. So moving out of Edgemont was no big deal to me. I was at home in Greenburgh still. And a lot of my friends whose kids were in school at the same time, they've done the same thing. They've moved out of Edgemont. They may still live in Westchester, but they're not paying ridiculous taxes in a community that doesn't welcome you. And as I said in the last time I saw Jordan's presentation, I'm sorry that I didn't know this history when I was living there, because I would have had a different attitude toward the white people who had just come up from New York City and thought that they belonged, whereas we had been there many years before and were basically seen as, you know, the undesirables. So that's my little spiel about Edgemont.
I just want to add, as you're bringing up taxes, Colleen, and I do so appreciate the sharing of personal stories. The article, one of the slides Jordan shared had an article that's recent, written by a woman I've easily fallen in love with, Dorothy A. Brown. And if you are not familiar with her book, The Whiteness of Wealth, Dorothy Brown grew up not far from us, right in the Bronx. And she's a professor at Emory, I believe, tax expert. And this is finally getting some traction. She was pushing this around for a long time and people were not publishing, not picking it up. It is finally getting some traction. I highly recommend the book, The Whiteness of Wealth. Yeah, so I'll turn it over to Edith after that.
Good evening. Good evening, all.
Good evening.
First, I want to say, I want to take this opportunity to thank Maria for providing us with this wonderful platform. We're having like a Black history lesson and experience, and it's fabulous. I first want to commend Jordan on his fabulous presentation. I am very, very impressed, extremely impressed with the amount of work and time that you put into providing us with information that I'm sure many of us didn't know about, but I'm so grateful because I had no idea. You know, we do research on history for many different reasons, but it would have never occurred to me to do research, you know, for that particular area. So again, thank you, Jordan. And also thank you, Jordan, for that diversity piece, because a lot of us get it twisted. When we hear diversity, we think, oh, you know, it's a lot of Black people or whatever, but it's not. Diversity doesn't mean Black. It means like everybody, that's what they call it. So thank you for bringing that up, because a lot of us see diversity from a different perspective. Then I want to say congratulations to Tasha. I see your name on a lot of literature for the Black Women's Political Caucus, of which I'm a member of the Mount Vernon chapter. And I just want to commend you for being out there, like an activist, being involved in all of these activities and your membership in so many meaningful and productive organizations. And you have quite an extensive portfolio, and I'm extremely proud of you.
Oh,
So I really am. But I just want to say this, I want to share, I wasn't born, I'm a Mount Vernon resident for 42 years. This was my dream since little girl to go up into suburbia. I've lived in Mount Vernon for 42 years, but I'm a Harlem girl. I was born and raised in Harlem. And it was my ultimate dream, you know, to get married and move to suburbia after I graduated from college. But what I really connected with were the reflections from the people who spoke. Although I wasn't raised in suburbia, I went to Stony Brook University, and that's kind of like living in a white neighborhood or whatever. So at the time when I went to Stony Brook, there were very few Black students, very few Hispanic students. So it was only a few of us. And so when I listened to the experiences that some of the people that Jordan interviewed, I connected because I thought about how, you know, being Black at a university where, you know, 95% of the people were white. I used to wear a hat all the time because I didn't have money to go get my hair straightened. So, and I connected with the other person who was in the cafeteria when, you know, they were talking about going to activities. So I didn't participate in a lot of activities because number one, I didn't have the money. And number two, I didn't have anything to wear. So it didn't bother me. I just stayed in the room and studied on the weekends. I connected with the teacher from Scarsdale High School. Whenever I saw either an African professor or a Black professor, I was like, oh my God, it's like Christmas time. So I made an effort to be not only their friend, but to just have them be a mentor and say, oh, you know, you're doing real well, or maybe you should try this activity or this class or whatever. So it's so important for us to have a connection because that's what really keeps us going. That gives us the faith when we don't have like mama or daddy or the minister or a brother or a sister or a friend to put their hand on your shoulder. But if you have somebody who looks like you, that gives you like more motivation. So, you know, I could connect with so many of them on so many levels. And it's so important for us to recognize that we've come this far by faith, you know, and I think about all of us, and I'm sure all of us have had some experiences, but look at us now. So the name of our song is How I Got Over. Because if I listen to all those other people and their experiences, I can go on and on and on all night, but I'm going to stop at that point just to say that I had another Zoom tonight. I was supposed to get off at 7:30, but I had to stay because this is such an exceptional program. And I'm glad that I'm here tonight. I'm glad I chose to stay. And thank you again so very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Edith. Everything makes sense now. The minute you said it was your dream to come to suburbia, everyone here has not had the pleasure of being welcomed into your home. It is idyllic. It is a beautiful, the pride, the decor, the rich, it's warm and it is beautiful, just like your spirit, Edith. So thank you so much for sharing that, because now we know a little bit more about each other.
And Tasha, not bad for a girl who came from temporary housing. Okay? Maria will tell you.
Well, listen, I still have family that lives in NYCHA in the Bronx. So that's where we come from and love there.
But I didn't live in NYCHA. I lived in tenements and I lived in temporary housing. So NYCHA is a step up. NYCHA is a step up.
Yeah.
Okay.
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 And it's a home that I don't know. If they ever bring back like the Westchester Home and Garden Tour, Edith's house should be a stop. That's all I'm going to say about
Beautiful.
that. Quantel, you are next. I see your hand.
Absolutely. Listen, this was a great presentation. One, I want to bring greetings on behalf of the congressman. I'm here on the congressman's behalf today. Maria, Tasha, wonderful, wonderful event. Jordan, I am so glad to have met you today. This is important stuff. Being one who has grown up here in Westchester, it's important that we actually understand our roots and understand that we belong here. And so, this month, we're exploring Black history in throughout the district. And because of your work, we know that Black folks have been in Scarsdale, contrary to popular belief. And so I want to thank you publicly in front of everybody here for your work, because this work is truly important. And then I'm just glad to be among so many friends, and I won't even call the names, but it's so good to see you. And please, anytime there are these kind of events, please keep me in the loop, because this is right up my alley. And again, thank you, thank you, thank you. Much gratitude. Have a wonderful night.
Wow.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna, speaking of staying in touch, I'm gonna put in the chat a way to stay in touch with the center's events. We just launched a new monthly e-newsletter. So I'll put in the chat how to sign up for that and let Jordan respond to those much deserved accolades for his work.
Am I supposed to do that now?
Jordan, if we end up riding together, let me tell you, you're gonna learn how to take these flowers when they're given to you, because you never know when you're gonna get another chance to just graciously accept someone just saying, I see you, I appreciate what you do, so take it.
Yeah, I'll take. I will take it. It feels good. Especially this pandemic has been so isolating. So it's like human contact is nice in any context. But I appreciate, and I'm glad that this resonates with you. And I'm glad, it made me it makes me a little nervous to do it before a Black audience. If I'm going to speak honestly, like it's I'm just worried about the tone that I set, and want to make sure that I'm speaking on the right, So anyway, so thank you. I'm glad I didn't say anything dumb, but I really appreciate it. No, and it's really I'm happy to have it go out to anyone who can take it and carry the work forward and keep on going, because it's really going back to that conversation that seems to be happening in public in the 60s, in the 70s a little bit, and then kind of gone away, and it needs to come back.
Yeah, I love that. I appreciate so much your honesty right there, right? That is an indication, and I'm so glad I'm still recording. That is an indication of exactly why I accepted this position at the Westchester Center for Racial Equity. It is so that people find spaces, have spaces where they can be their authentic, vulnerable selves and do the important work of racial bridging. So you showed up, took a brave step. I took a brave step. A lot of expectations about what was going to come from the Center for Black History Month. And I was like, well, there's this white guy named Jordan, and that's it. Thanks for coming, guys. And it worked out, right? You gotta trust your instincts and just do your best. And it might get messy, and you might have made a mistake, and tone might have been intended to go one way and been interpreted another way, but we're here in this space together to work it out. That's what I think a lot of the work is about, coming together and saying our commitment to our community being racially equitable is more important to me than my mixed feelings in a moment. And so thanks for that. Okay, I saw Michelle's hand, and I don't know if we lost her. Michelle
No, I'm still
Brown.
here.
Okay,
Hi, how are
absolutely.
you?
Great, how are you?
I am good, thank you. Thank you, Tasha. I came in a little late, but I came in when I heard Jordan say people of color hiding behind that. And, that is a thing. And I also hear you saying, Jordan, that you're concerned with maybe your tone. And I always look at people's heart, right? Intention. I'd rather be in a space where people are vulnerable, whether it's whatever it looks like, and they're being honest, than being in a space where people are in their head trying to figure out the right thing to say. So thank you for that part. But yeah, I have conversations often about whether we should say the word Black people, or if we should use, another term, people of color. It covers such a dynamic when we say people of color. And the whole diversity thing, these are terms, right, that are being thrown around, and they're not new. These aren't new words in the dictionary, but we're grabbing onto them and we're using them in spaces where we feel that if we say a common word, people have a common understanding. And it concerns me when that happens sometimes, because it's another way to cover up the exact nature of what's happening. As mentioned, diversity, but how many Black people really do live there? I live in Croton, so I get it, the whole thing about getting equity in your home, getting your kid out of school, and like moving, because there's nothing really for me here as a Black woman. And it's terrible that that is the truth, but that is the truth. So I just thank you for having this. Thank you, Tasha, for keeping the education, enlightenment, and the space for people to come and learn and grow. And it's very enriching and empowering. So thank you.
I just want to, I'm glad Michelle is here, because Michelle is one of our co-chairs for Greenberg Against Systemic Racism Housing Committee. And we're working on a report. I'm just going to read a little excerpt on what we're working on, because as I said, we're talking about the historical presence of discrimination and how it works through systems. So the displacement of African Americans in Greenberg is primarily attributed to rising housing costs, property assessments that are biased, and high taxes have made remaining in Greenberg extremely difficult for individuals and families, particularly those who have lower incomes. So the wage gap between white households and Black households puts the majority of Black people in the lower income gap. And the difference, even when we attribute for those of higher net worth, is 6.9 times different. So white households hold 6.9 times more wealth. And housing stock in Greenberg has been tight for years, also because of the presence of not allowing for multiple unit dwellings, particularly to accommodate for more people. The practice of being exclusive is a practice that we see in suburbia, and certainly Greenberg is not exempt from that. The government lending programs beginning in the 30s have strongly favored white applicants and excluded Black applicants. And just to quote from The Color of Money, in 1988, there was an investigative reporter, his name is Bill Dedman, and he won the Pulitzer Prize for this work, which used federal mortgage data to show that lenders nationwide reject Black loan applicants at twice the rate of whites, and that of high income Blacks are rejected almost at the same rate as low income whites. So white middle income neighborhoods have received 4 times as many loans as middle income Black areas. So I wanted to bring it into policy because we are looking for more partners, shameless plug, to really look at the policies that affect housing in Greenberg and Westchester as a whole, and to work together to try to really encourage our representatives in government to change how we're doing business and to change how we're doing development, to include more room for middle, high income, low income Black people to survive and thrive in Westchester County. So if anyone is interested in any of that work, please reach out to Maria And we will connect you with activists in the area that are really working hard to bring more people into Greenburgh and to keep people that live here in Greenburgh. So I just wanted to also state that.
Thanks so much, really, for that and for the work I hope people do. Even if they're not right there in Greenburgh, there are implications for the rest of the county. I, being from Mount Vernon, have a question. I don't think there's any other question at this time, and this might be our last one. And I just want to read in the chat before I begin. And housing equity versus appraisals for Black homeowners, home depreciation for your same home or over your white neighbor. Yep, Michelle. Back to that original question when Jordan was presenting, right? Is it about the property values or the value of the people? Like, what is it that you're actually assessing there? So when I hear about Edgemont and Greenburgh and even Scarsdale, right? Whether it's historical consideration and specifically now, because I only have been alive for about 4 decades. I assume in my mind, so I'm telling on myself here, maybe I should stop recording, but I'll be fair. I assume in my mind when I consider the history of Black people in Edgemont or Scarsdale and the history of Black people in Mount Vernon, right? That I will hear a different story. I make that assumption in my mind, and to just name it, it's around wealth, it's around class, it's around just geographic difference, right? And I know, Jordan, I'm not putting you on the spot. I know you have not done a deep analysis or historical review of that history of Black people in Mount Vernon. Others have, in some ways, different than how this is laid out, but there are some texts. I wish I'd done a comparison now. But if we could just imagine, right? I like to activate imaginations, especially once you have the experience of touching real history, to be like, ooh, let's imagine how these two communities develop so differently, taking into account geography, class, all manner of things. I think that while there are some similarities because of the ways that anti-Black racism impact generally, there are also some like specific things that I feel are fundamentally different, if not about the truth, than about the stories that get out there. Like, how did I end up with this story in my head that Mount Vernon would be so different? They're not so far apart. They're far enough apart, but not that far apart. And yet it's out there, right? Like, so I just, if you want to respond to that today, great. If not, but it's in the back of my mind, and I don't know where else I'll get to talk it out with folks who might have ideas.
I'll throw one thing in there, which is not, obviously a personal, but what I would attribute it to is zoning. So Scarsdale is unique. It was the first non-city in the US, in New York State, to adopt a zoning in 1922. They wanted to bring a chocolate factory in that nobody wanted. So Scarsdale was actually late to develop, because in Edgemont too, because there was no water access. Unlike everyone else, if you were farming, you can't get your crops out. So what that meant is that there was a lot of land, and then as things kind of exploded in the early part of the 20th century, you had a lot of professionals moving in. They could commute down to the city. And they wanted to, so they had essentially, they wanted to make things just so. And then one of the things that they did was zoning, and they defined Scarsdale very early on as a community of single family homes. So there were apartment buildings that were rejected and things like that. And they didn't want business throughout, and they didn't want multiple dwellings. And that till today, and even that's true in Edgemont, but not on Central Avenue, it just limits who can afford to be there. So that's one of the fundamental things. And it's a funny thing. So now, as you fast forward now, and this also relates to the diversity talk that we were talking about, and how, the Asian population has increased. People can say from these communities, we're laissez-faire. If you want to buy $1 million home, come on in. We won't stop you. And that's sort of the argument, but it doesn't recognize, obviously, the legacy of that. It doesn't recognize the overall society. So that's kind of where we're at now. So there's no, in the 60s, there was an active attempt to bridge that gap and encourage more Black families to buy in, recognizing bank discrimination. There were efforts made to loan Black families the down payment, because white families often had family wealth, or they could borrow the down payment from somebody else. Because of the whole legacy of redlining and bank discrimination and job discrimination, even Black professionals couldn't afford to live in Scarsdale without the down payment. So they actually set up a nonprofit to try to rectify that at some point in time. It was kind of cool. One last thing I'm going to say, and this is on the federal front. In 1971, the Scarsdale Board of Ed, over the community's objection, agreed to take, I can't remember what the number was, but it was something like every year about 25 kindergarten kids from Mount Vernon and allow them to be bused up and go to school in Scarsdale. There was a federal program that would make up the difference in the tax dollars. So if cost of educating a Mount Vernon kid was $1,000 and the cost of educating a Scarsdale kid was $2,000, they would throw another $1,000. The feds would throw another $1,000 in. So that was a federal program that enabled this to happen. Scarsdale agreed to it. The Board of Ed agreed to it. The Mount Vernon Board of Ed, which at that point was, I believe it was 7 people, of whom 6 were white, voted against it because they were worried about the internal busing in Mount Vernon then being split between white and Black. They didn't want to open up that can of worms and have people from the Black part of town going to the white part of town and vice versa. But it's something that I think about a lot, that if that had gone through, I think it could have, it would have been a substantial tie between the communities. It could have been, it could have grown. I don't know what would have happened, but it's an enormous, it's a lost opportunity for how things could have gone.
Can I piggyback on that with the zoning, Maria? Do we have time?
Yeah, go ahead.
So Greenberg is zoned 73% single family homes, to Jordan's point. And the push to bring more multifamily homes is attributed to the need to do it, and the resistance comes from wanting to be exclusive. So we are always fighting for reform within the town and the different neighborhoods of the town to include more people and to make it more livable for more people. Urban renewal is a zoning and policy upset of Black homes and Black businesses, but it was legal and it was supported because there was money attached to it. The town got money to implement and remove blight and slums, as opposed to investing the money into those communities. So we know that the most thriving communities have the most resources. So when you take resources out, or when you remove people, that creates poverty, that creates displacement, and in this case of Black homeowners and Black business owners. So it's definitely the zoning, it's the practices from the banks, as we both have mentioned, and it's then the thought of who should live in my neighborhood that works against thriving Black communities being more prevalent in Greenberg as they are in Mount Vernon.
Wow, thank you both for those thoughtful responses. And even, of course, Jordan coming through with the historical perspective too. I appreciate it so much. It looks like there are more hands raised. I was just about to say it is not happening, but yes, I did not catch the order in which these came. So I'm just gonna go in the order that they're showing up right now. And I have Michelle Brown first, and then Nicole Benjamin. And then I think if no one else raises after, we will close. So Michelle.
Hi, thank you. Hi, yes, I'm here. I just wanted to say that politicians carry this out. You know, the people we vote in carry this out. None of this happens if they don't permit it to happen. And no matter how loud our Black voice is, no matter how much our Black bodies show up, if they're not willing, them meaning the political system, whether it's the mayor or the town board or, you know, the Albany, whomever, are not willing to change it systemically, this is not going to change. The numbers are not going to change. Just like in a small town like Croton, they're like, they have no apartments, you know, like they're condos that people can rent out as apartments, right? And there's, you know, I just think that the way in which it's now they're talking about putting housing by the train station, but who's that housing for? You know, I said, is it low income? I got no answer. You know, so again, it's the people that are controlling this that are keeping this the same way. And until we can raise people up in our community to vote these people out and create change, I just believe that we're always going to be putting out fires. And that's a whole distraction about getting to the root of what's really going on. So thank you.
Thank you, Michelle. Nicole, did you still have another comment or question?
About your question juxtaposing Mount Vernon to Edgemont. So in my mind, that created a question for Jordan. I recently learned that Bronxville was a sundown town. So would the juxtaposition be between Bronxville birthing Mount Vernon and then Edgemont Scarsdale birthing Fairview? Can you comment on that, Jordan?
That's interesting. I didn't know that about Bronxville, but knowing what I know about, well, I'm not gonna complete that sentence. That's interesting. You know, I don't know that I could necessarily, you know, connect those dots, but you know, it's birthing them. I mean, I guess yes. I mean that's, it might not be necessarily Fairview. I think of like there's a part of New Rochelle that I'm right next to, you know, that has Black families, wealthier Black families in it. I'm not sure that I can totally answer that, but I think it's logical, you know.
And thank you. And we have Mary Dillard in the chat saying she can answer and she teaches at Sarah Lawrence. So please, Mary, join the conversation.
Hello, I didn't want to put my camera on because I wasn't sure what I was looking like, but
that's fine.
I thought that so many people knew that, I thought that people knew that Bronxville was a sundown town, and it started, and part of it started out when like Italian immigrants and Irish immigrants, basically anyone who was not a WASP was considered to be undesirable in a lot of Westchester towns. The point that Michelle made about voting certain politicians out, one of the things that I've learned about Bronxville and other towns is that it's often certain individuals, certain powerful individuals. So William Doozer Lawrence, for example, was very active in designing Bronxville in particular ways, so that there are all kinds of cul-de-sacs, the streets are very windy, they don't make any daggone sense if you don't live there. And that was all designed to keep all kinds of people out, including Black people. So my ears perked up about the sundown town piece, but I don't know what the original question was. But the other part that I would say is that this notion of when I first moved to Yonkers, I had a Bronxville PO. I think a lot of you know what that is. Like, you have a post office box, or your address has a certain, I mean, Sarah Lawrence is actually in Yonkers, right? But it has a Bronxville PO. And the joke that I always make is the whole campus could burn down. But they will never move that post office because of the address. But that's right. So what Tasha's saying about zoning, that these are all ways that elite spaces are not only created, but protected. And it just moves, it has moved throughout New York history and US history, from perceptions of who people should be protected by. So, or protected from. So like when Italian Americans were not considered to be white in the ways that they are now, they were also considered to be a threat. But one of the most persistent threats, obviously, unfortunately, historically, has been Black people and has been African Americans. And we can't ignore in that regard also the history of slavery in New York. That there's a potent history of slavery in New York State that is never talked about, or that is rarely talked about. That's changing now, but that all of those legacies make a difference in terms of what our experiences are still today.
Thank you so much for that, Mary. So many resonant points in your commentary there. And just so we're all on the same page, can anyone, be it Mary, Jordan, Tasha, Michelle, who brought this, or Nicole, sorry, who raised this question, just want to get a working definition of sundown town.
Okay, I'm sorry.
I mean, I watch Lovecraft Country, so I'm up to speed, but you know.
I'm a single mom of a very busy 11-year-old, so I don't watch anything that's not on Nickelodeon. So it means that you, depending on your hue, must be out of town when the sun goes down. So that is the way that, that's the way that exclusivity and elitism, segregation and racism are reinforced. And people are often shocked that Bronxville was a sundown town. But as someone who has been at Sarah Lawrence for over 20 years and had a very hard time finding housing when I first moved to this area, how welcoming is it now? I mean, how welcoming is it now?
Mary, I wanted to add that Yonkers in totality was on the original sundown list. It changed, but that most people would be surprised to know that Yonkers in itself. But when you talk about the topography of Yonkers with the hills and the windy streets, that it was intentional. It was intentional.
Yes, thank you. That again, that segregation, the ways that you in Yonkers also you get all these dead ends, streets that just dead end. That is one of the most active ways that suburban designers and builders made sure to keep communities exclusive while pretending that they didn't do it. So, and then in particular, this cul-de-sac thing. Oftentimes, if communities were forced, this happened where I grew up in South Jersey, in Mount Laurel, which is a place that was of a major housing discrimination case. What designers will do if they are forced to integrate a community, they'll put all the Black families in the cul-de-sacs with the idea that, potential buyers driving through won't go into a cul-de-sac, so they won't notice that potential white buyers won't notice that Black people are there. It's amazing. I mean, as a kid, I thought it was great because we always knew where to find the Black families, right? But then I couldn't understand why my father was like enraged every time he drove certain places. But of course, now I do.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, I am not cutting off this conversation. I am bringing us to the end of this program. I hope that by offering some history and making it current with our community conversation, by sharing our personal experiences and asking questions of one another, that this conversation just keeps going, not just through the end of this month, but throughout the rest of our lives, really. You know, there's so much to keep learning just about our own local history. And I hope that folks take the opportunity and the platform of Black History Month to make that a practice, to know more about just where you are, the land you're on, who was on it before, who has never been on it, and why not. That's a practice you can have the rest of this Black History Month. I.e., I don't need to plan no more programs for y'all. Y'all got work to do. You can go watch all of Mr. Copeland's videos. You can talk to your neighbors. You can talk to someone you haven't met before. You have so much to do in just a few 25 days. I hope you make it on time. And that's why, you know, we say Black history is American history, and it is all the time, 365 all year long. So do not feel restricted by this program coming to an end. Do not feel restricted by February coming to an end. Don't feel restricted by absurd arguments that you can't handle the full history and truth of your community, of your country. You go do your work, and you will find yourself better for it, better informed and more ready to handle achieving racial equity together. So again, so many thanks, so much gratitude to Jordan Copeland for your time this evening, for your vulnerability and courage. I am personally not in charge of cookout invites. I give them out real freely. And so my cousin took that away from me a few years ago. But you know, you are welcome back at the Westchester Center for Racial Equity anytime, okay? And Tasha, I wanna thank you so much. As I was thinking, how do I connect this? How do I connect this? I said, Tasha. And I just thank you so much for coming through again, girlfriend. It's always good to have an expert as a buddy. So with that, I bid you all adieu this evening. And I hope that you sign up for the Roundup, which is the name of the Westchester Center for Racial Equity e-newsletter that comes out every month. This recording, unedited, just as it is, will be sent to you next week. And an edited version that takes our community conversation out will be sent out to everyone on the email list and likely on the YWCA website. So thank you so much for coming. And I will remove our spotlights and let everyone just say bye to each other, because that's a fun thing to do. I thank you so much.
Thank
How do I
you.
remove myself?
Everybody.
I don't want to be spotlight. Oh.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Good night, everyone.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye. Okay, honey.
Bye.
Maria,
All
excellent,
right.
excellent,
Thanks so
excellent.
much. This was so great.
Thank you
This
so
was
much,
excellent.
Jordan.
Thank
Oh,
you.
yes, you
Thank
can
you.
say bye,
It was
Mina.
really, really
Mina wants
wonderful
to say
experience.
bye.
Bye, Mina.
We'll see you on Galentine's Day, Tasha. Jordan,
Yes.
I don't know. I might have a counterfeit cookout. Don't tell anybody. Let me stop
All right.
recording. And you
I'm
come to that
showing
one.
up.
All right.